Hi, my name is Christopher Michael Yap, and I am a first-year PhD candidate at the NARA Institute of Science and Technology. I study game studies, and in particular, I work with interactive narrative. And in this video, I would like to present my paper entitled Genetic Predestiny versus Digital Free Will, a critical analysis of character foils in Metal Gear Solid. This is the paper that I presented originally at the Replaying Japan 2014 Second Annual Conference on Japan Game Studies at University of Alberta, Edmonton, on August 24th, 2014. So the basic layout of this presentation is going to be as follows. The first thing I want to do is I want to define what's a character foil. Now, essentially, this is a literary device, and I want to, in the second part of the presentation, I want to discuss our main research goal with this paper, which is essentially to observe how foils work in interactive games. And to discuss this, we chose in part 3 the game Metal Gear Solid for the PlayStation in 1998, and we're using this as a sort of critical lens to observe how a major character foil is portrayed in a game and how well it works in a game. And sort of to discuss this, we're going to be talking about one of the main themes of Metal Gear Solid, which is fate versus free will. We'll be identifying the various character foils in Metal Gear Solid and discussing how that fate versus free will theme is expressed and addressed through character foils. And in particular, we would like to touch on the Die Conundrum, which was a sort of confusing plot point that helped to sort of elaborate on that fate versus free will character foil relationship. In part 4 of this presentation, I'm going to be discussing how the interactivity of inherent to the game medium and character foils sort of work for and against each other. And in part 5, we can conclude with some inferences based on our observations and some design considerations for game designers hoping to incorporate character foil into their games. So the first thing, what's a character foil? Essentially, in a story or a narrative, it's a pair of characters who, by their differences and sometimes very strong similarities, highlight each other's qualities. As a former English major, I can sort of get into the more traditional examples, such as from Shakespeare's Hamlet, we have Hamlet and Fortinbras, or from Shelley's Frankenstein, we have Dr. Victor Frankenstein and the monster he created. But I thought I would start with an example that's a little bit more modern and well-known. So here we have Mr. Spock, portrayed by Leonard Nimoy from Star Trek. And of course, his character foil, or the person who is sort of opposite to him in certain qualities, but also very similar, is Captain Kirk. Of course, here is William Shatner. So basically, these two characters, through their similarities and differences, tend to highlight those similarities and differences. And in these ways, the show of Star Trek can use those differences to sort of make various commentaries on the different kinds of thematic things they have going on in each episode. And this sort of enhances the narrative in general. Another example that we can look at is from Fight Club. We have Tyler Durden and the narrator, sorry. And to another sort of big example would be from the Harry Potter franchise. We have protagonist Harry Potter and main antagonist Voldemort. And in particular, this foil is interesting because the two of them share some very essential qualities. And I don't want to spoil it for anybody who's not seen it, but this is a pretty major character foil that we can use to sort of, when we compare the two, we get to understand the story a little bit better. So how do foils work in games? Character foils are not exclusive to literature or cinema. They can essentially exist in any narrative medium which employs characters. But what I want to know is, how do these sort of character foils behave in interactive games? And then, can we use this sort of literary device in games in general? If so, how well does this work, or how well does this not work? We're going to be finding out in small ways, but the first thing we want to do is look at our case study, which is Metal Gear Solid. And a little bit of background, we're just talking about the first Metal Gear Solid game, which came out from Konami in 1998 for the PlayStation. This is going to be the third official installment in the Metal Gear franchise, and this game is considered by many to be a sort of classical or seminal stealth genre game. It is also considered to be commercially successful, and I personally think that this commercial success is expressed best through its continuing legacy. And in fact, many of us are anticipating the release of Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain, in Q4 of this year, 2014. So just for clarification's sake, we're going to be focusing our analysis only on the game Metal Gear Solid and not the subsequent sequels, although our future studies do hope to achieve this. So the first thing, let's talk about the plot of Metal Gear Solid. It's a very convoluted plot, but to put it simply, the protagonist and player character of Solid Snake must prevent the rogue soldier Liquid Snake from launching the ultimate nuclear superweapon codenamed Metal Gear, which is pictured here on this slide in the lower right corner. Now, essentially, boil it all down, Solid Snake must prevent Metal Gear. But the game is billed as a tactical espionage stealth game, so I want to focus on the word espionage because through the course of the plot gets awfully convoluted. Solid Snake begins to question, he himself begins to question who he's working for and why, because it turns out that there are so many secrets and twists and turns in the game. It becomes quite knotted up. And so in the course of this sort of convoluted plot, we get the theme, which is fate versus free will. Essentially, the game is asking on many occasions through the narrative, why do you do the things that you do? Many of the characters answer this question in their own ways, but the two main answers that surface are, I do the things I do because of my genes, because my DNA says so. Or they say, I do the things I do because I want to. So this is sort of fate versus free will. It's pretty binary. It's very this or that, but through the course of the plot, we basically see many sort of character foils surfacing in Metal Gear Solid. Primarily, each of the main characters in Metal Gear Solid is contrasted with Solid Snake, the player character. And it's not just the good or bad guys, it's everyone, really. So we have boss fights where this happens. We have the meeting and discussing of things with the new supporting characters, such as your commanding officer, Colonel Campbell, or your data save officer, which is Mei Ling, or the medical officer, which is Dr. Naomi Hunter. And each of these sort of character foils and discussions on the codec, which is sort of the radio in the game, discusses these sorts of themes, like why do you do the things you do? Or is it because of it's a genetic thing, or I believe that genetics has nothing to do with it? In particular, the character foils that are very strong in the game happen between each of the boss characters, which are pictured here in the lower right corner of this slide. Essentially, the members of the Rogue Special Forces unit Foxhound. Each of them before and after the boss fights, respectively, each kind of have their own monologue section where they address this theme of fate versus free will at length. It's not extremely subtle, but it does bring the point home. As it turns out, many of these boss characters seem to acknowledge genetics as a major factor in their actions. Particularly Liquid Snake, who is the main antagonist. He really cites genetics as being the main impetus for all of the evils he commits in the game. This justifies his actions. The main character foil in Metal Gear Solid happens to be that of the sons of Big Boss. And essentially Big Boss, in the plot of the game, he is a now deceased legendary soldier, the ultimate soldier. He was biologically sterile, so he had no children. But the United States government could not let him die, so they basically cloned him in a project called Les Enfants Terribles. And as a result, his sons, Solid Snake and Liquid Snake, were born out of this experiment. They are essentially genetic clones of Big Boss, and as a result, Solid and Liquid Snake are genetically identical twins of each other. This sets up a very powerful character foil. They're extremely related in being almost made of the same stuff, but they couldn't be more different in terms of ideology. So then we have Liquid versus Solid Snake. And the Metal Gear Solid narrative emphasizes this dichotomy in a lot of different ways through these characters. So we have Liquid versus Solid, which essentially means nature versus nurture, or fate versus free will. The important thing to note is that Liquid Snake and Solid Snake are the manifestations of this debate between fate and free will within the narrative Metal Gear Solid. And they do get a lot of talking time in the game, which helps out a lot when you're trying to understand what the game's narrative is what kind of commentary it's trying to make on fate versus free will. But this is where things get a little bit strange. So let's talk about what I call the Die Conundrum. Now, essentially, in the game, there is a fictional virus that was invented by the United States government called Die. And Die is a programmable virus. And what you do is, it's an assassination tool, a tricky and sneaky one. The Die virus can be programmed with a list of targets. So what happens is, if the Die virus infects you, it'll go ahead and cross-check your DNA code with the codes that it has in its kill list. If there's a match, it will kill you via heart attack. If there is no match, you're completely fine, and Die is completely benign. Now, Solid Snake is at the beginning of the plot of Metal Gear Solid injected with Fox Die unknowingly. So as he's going through the base and the mission, he's infecting everyone he meets. And whether or not that person's on the kill list or not will determine if they just drop dead of a heart attack. Now, here's the syllogism. It's that at the end of the game, Fox Die eventually kills Liquid Snake. So the problem is that Liquid Snake and Solid Snake are genetic twins of each other. So it stands to logically reason that Fox Die will kill Solid Snake, which would be extremely unfortunate, but as most of you who've played the game know, ultimately Solid Snake does not succumb to Fox Die. And when players in the narrative sort of turn to the inventor of Fox Die, Dr. Naomi Hunter, for an answer, she essentially says that DNA governs a person's potential strengths and destinies. And the game concludes not too long after that, really, and most of the characters are okay with that explanation. The game's conclusion is thus: both fate and free will have influence, but ultimately it's a mystery, which is a kind of strange place to leave the player, but that's how the game ends. Now, as a side note, I would like to say that this Fox Die Conundrum is revisited and addressed again in subsequent games in the franchise, but today's analysis is focusing just on the narrative of Metal Gear Solid, so maybe in future work we'll be able to talk about this some more as it pertains to the over-narrative. Now I want to sort of discuss how the character foil and interactivity work together in games. If a foil is meant to highlight the characteristics of two characters, then as a narrative, Metal Gear Solid was able to do this. Because the player character of Solid Snake was established very prominently as a sufficiently unique character, meant and understood to be separate from the actual player. So essentially what the game is doing with this character foil is it's comparing two characters that are understood to be separate from the player. So Solid compared with Liquid. Nice character foil. Just if Metal Gear Solid is read as a narrative only. But Metal Gear Solid is a game. So in an interactive game, it can be fundamentally problematic to have a true character foil between a player character and another non-player character. So in this diagram here, we have Solid Snake in the middle. He's your protagonist. He's a player character. He's the guy who you experience the game through as a player. He is being compared to a non-player character, which is the main antagonist of Liquid Snake. But the problem is that the player character also shares a relationship with the player. He is a vacant vessel for you to sort of explore the game in, but the two are not equal. So in this case it works, but if, for example, if it's a game like Grand Theft Auto where you are filling in that character with a lot of who you are, it's very difficult to make a direct character foil with any of the NPCs in an intended way. It might happen by accident, but that's no good. So essentially, this gets more complex when you figure out that basically the player is a variable character within the game. I mean, upon every single playthrough, it could potentially be a different human being controlling Solid Snake. Now, in the case of Metal Gear, this sort of works out because the thing is, well, here, let me put it this way. I would venture that most of the players of Metal Gear Solid have never had any real-life experience being a member or a living legend member of Foxhound Special Forces unit. So, you know, most of us are coming into this game as complete non-soldiers, completely oblivious of the world. And this is reflected in a lot of gameplay points. You know, Solid Snake often calls back home to figure out what he's supposed to do or how to climb a ladder. This is sort of a accepted game convention. You kind of have to learn how to play the game. But if Solid Snake and the player character and the player are equated with each other, it's very, very fundamentally difficult and almost impossible to have a true character foil in this case. So, in conclusion, character foils can be used effectively in games to both highlight the qualities of the characters and address narrative themes if the foil is between two characters who are understood to be distinct from the player, and/or the foil is between two non-player characters. So, we were able to observe this through the game Metal Gear Solid, but what's the next step? For the next part of this research, we need to analyze other significant character foils in other games for both effectiveness as a narrative device and to corroborate what we observed in Metal Gear Solid. So this research could potentially go in a couple different directions. We kind of want to look at the other games in Metal Gear Solid franchise and see how this character foil carries out with other characters, because there are quite a lot of citable foils and things like that. Or we can just go into other different franchises, and we're sort of looking into other franchises as we speak. So if you're interested in game studies or in anything I talked about in today's presentation, go ahead and drop me a line. You can hit me up at Gmail, Facebook, Twitter, or we're also running a Video Game Studies Indiegogo campaign, which is doing pretty well right now. So if you're interested, come and check it out. That's me, Chris Yap from NARA Institute of Science and Tech. Thanks for listening.